Welcome everyone to my K20 K24 engine build. Today we're going to walk through together on how I built my K24. By the end of this, you should be able to build one exactly like this on your own. But first, there's a few caveats that we need to discuss. There are a few main things that I'm not going to be showing you how to do in this video when it comes to building this engine. Those things include building the cylinder head, measuring bearing clearance, and gapping piston rings. I will explain more about each of those things when the time comes. Now that that's all taken care of, let's get this thing put together. I started off by cleaning and painting the engine block. This is not a necessary step, it's just something that I really desperately needed to do. I also painted the valve cover and the timing chain cover. The next step I took, and this is something that I wasn't aware of at the time, but luckily I had the K20Z1 that we picked up from my friend Kyle. If you're gonna run the factory oil cooler, you have to pull all of the gear off of a K20Z1 or just buy it new or used offline or through a junkyard if you're able, and you have to swap all of those components onto the K24. The K24 has a threaded fitting that goes into the block where you screw the oil filter onto. You have to remove that. And a lot of people say that you can use some vice grips with some tubing attached to the end of them, and you can clamp that on and twist it off. I didn't do that because I'm never going to use this fitting again, so I just used my channel locks and twisted it off. After that was taken care of, I put the threaded insert into the oil cooler itself, put on a new O-ring, and attached it to the engine. The oil cooler has a metal tang around the 11 o'clock position that will help locate itself once you attach it to the block. I oiled up everything so that way it created a nice seal. So we're going to torque this to 54 foot-pounds, and it's a 30mm socket. You also have to bolt up the fitting that mounts to the side of the engine block. That fitting came off of a K20Z1, which is a Type S engine. Or you can alternatively go with a S2000 fitting that will thread inside of the back of the block just above the oil cooler. Regardless of which route you take, you have to remove the 10mm Allen bung that is capping off the inside of the K24 water jacket. So you got to pull that out so that way the coolant can actually flow between the inside of the block back to the outside. Once you have all that taken care of, now the real work begins. Ideally, you would want to do this in the cleanest environment possible. For me, that's right back here in my little work area. Do whatever works best for you. Just try and be aware of all the dirt and dust that you might be tracking in and out if you're going to be moving a lot. There just needs to be a general cleanliness about your work here. I used a combination of clean rags, alcohol, and compressed air to clean my engine block. It's extremely important that you are using lintless rags when you're cleaning the inside of your engine. Anything left over inside your engine after it's finished being assembled creates more work for your oil system to clean out, so you want to help that as much as possible. Your goal here is to make the cylinder walls as clean as possible because any debris that's left over once you install your pistons can get trapped between the piston and ring or onto the cylinder wall itself, and it can cause scoring, which is obviously not good. Once you've doubled and triple checked the cleanliness of the inside of your engine, we can move on to the next step. All right, so after you make sure that you've got everything nice and clean, you blow everything out with an air hose, now is the time that we are going to oil up the cylinder walls. I know, crazy, right? You just cleaned it, now you're gonna oil it. But we're gonna oil everything up and get the pistons oiled up, and we're gonna get them inside the block. First, I gotta show you how to build a piston. So at this point, I wanted to briefly discuss ring gap with you guys. That is one of the caveats to this build that I said that I wouldn't really be going over and showing you how to do because the machine shop took care of that for me after they bored my block out after they pressed the sleeves in. This engine is going to be built for boost. Boost is just another word for saying that I'm going to turbocharge it, for those of you that don't know. And turbocharger is probably the best bang for buck horsepower adder that you can install onto an engine. Albeit expensive, it can get you insanely high numbers depending on what your setup is going to be. Ring gap is especially important though because when you add boost to an engine, a combustion chamber in an engine is already extremely hot. So when you add boost or forced induction, you're cramming a lot more air into the combustion chamber. If you heat up the engine enough, though, that gap can decrease to the amount of the rings touching. And when those rings touch, they can't go anywhere. That's what causes ring gland failure. That's what causes scoring on your cylinder walls. It's what causes catastrophic failure. The manufacturer of your pistons will send you a chart that you can use to gauge how much piston ring gap that you need to file down. This is different for every engine application. It's based on the material of your pistons, the material of your sleeves, the material of your rings themselves. So my specific factor is that I want to push roughly 30 pounds of boost. That factor is 0.055. So what you do is that based on 30 pounds of boost, you multiply your bore size by 0.055. So my bore size is 87.5 millimeter, which equals out to 3.445 inches. You multiply 3.445 by 0.055, and that gets you your ring gap of 19 thousandths. So when you place the ring inside of the combustion chamber or the cylinder wall, you want to take a feeler gauge and measure out your gap to be 19 thousandths. And as far as my application is concerned, your second ring will always be 2 thousandths larger, or the gap on your second ring will be 2 thousandths larger than your top ring. So my second ring is 21 thousandths ring gap. That is a very basic rundown of what ring gap is and the importance of it. And you can purchase ring gapper tools offline for fairly cheap, but it's not something that I was equipped to handle at the time, but it's something that you really need to keep in mind. So that goes along with cost. So if you want to do it yourself, you can save yourself a little bit of time, a little bit of money, but you have to purchase the tools and you have to be able to slowly and consciously file down your piston rings to the exact specifications that the manufacturer predetermines for you. So just keep all that in mind. So this process can seem a little daunting, but I promise you, it's really, really not. So the first thing that you're going to want to do is make sure that you orient the piston with the rod correctly. And so the easiest way to remember how to do that is that I've got all these markings on mine. I did these way back when. This is going to be cylinder number 1. I've already predetermined that. But if you can see in here, there are these little cutouts, these relief cutouts. This is where the bearing sits. This is where the bearing actually catches up against the inside of the rod cap and the rod itself. These always need to face, at least on Hondas, they need to face the exhaust side. That's the way they are from the factory. That's the way manufacturer recommends it. And so it's really easy to tell on my pistons in particular which one is the exhaust and which one is the intake. So the exhausts are going to be the smaller ones. So you want to look at these relief cutouts and put the exhaust and the relief cutouts on the same exact side. That's all you got to do on that. So knowing that, and these can only go in one way. I've got this arrow pointing to the front of the engine. The front of the engine is where the timing chain is. But you can also tell, oh, this obviously goes on the intake side. This obviously goes on the exhaust side. Let's get this thing put together, and then I'm going to show you how to install rings and how to position the rings the way that Wiseco wants you to. So I've got these upgraded turbo wrist pins. The part number is S734. Wiseco sends a brand new wrist pin with each one of the pistons, when they're brand new. But I didn't want to take any chances, so I went ahead and got this beefy guy right here. And so I'm going to grab some assembly lube to help, aid with the installation process. But we're going to get this thing slotted in and join these two, hopefully permanently, together. So this is the assembly lube that I'm using. This is a Klebite bearing guard. This was recommended to me by the machine shop that did pretty much all the big important stuff to the engine block. So this is what they use, so that's what I'm going to use. Klebite makes bearings, but we're using ACL bearings, but we'll get to that when we get to that. So I have already pre-installed one of the retaining clips inside of this piston. So you want to go ahead and do that. I'm going to show you how I install them. You can actually do it with your hands, but just to save your hands a little bit, because I know that this can really tear you up, I'm going to show you a quick, easy way to do it. Don't use like a flathead screwdriver or anything metal or nothing like that. Again, we are going to orient these two items the correct way. This side is smooth. This side has these little cutouts that lock the bearing down. And then we've got the exhaust side, small ones. slot this in, just like so. So now that we've got that like that, we're going to get a little bit of bearing guard, and this stuff is thick. And we are just going to lube this up super well. You could probably just use engine oil. I want to go the extra mile and make sure that this is going to have plenty of lubrication. And then we're just going to slot this in. I gotta get the rod in there, and these are free float. So what that means is that it's not a press fit, which is good for us. And so that's installed. So what a free float means is that not only can the rod spin freely on the wrist pin itself, but the wrist pin can spin inside of the piston itself, which I think is a really, really good design. So then we have our retaining clip, get a little bit of lube on it. And the easiest way to install it is, you see the top here that's got like this concave cut. You want to lip the two ends that are open inside of that concave cut, basically. And then I like to take a plastic trim tool. There it is. Boom. In. Done. Already did the other side like that. So this rod and piston assembly is good to go. So now we're going to throw on the rings, and I'm just going to show you guys exactly how to do that with your hands. All right, I like to just wipe a little bit of the oil residue off, just so I can hang on to it a little bit better. This is going to get coated in oil, so don't overthink it. So what we're going to do is we're going to follow Wiseco's spreadsheet here to the T. Each one of these boxes comes with this list, so they're all the same. But what you want to do is you want to get the oil scraper out, and you want to install that first. And so the oil scraper goes on first, and then you've got the two small oil scraping rings, and they're very, very thin, those two guys. And then you have got the top ring and the secondary ring. So this is going to be your secondary ring. It's the darker ring. It's got an edge that is chamfered towards the inside of the piston. And then your top ring is a more silver color, and it's got a chamfer that goes more towards the outside of the piston, so it's cut upward, kind of like that. And so what you want to do is you want to get your oil ring, and you want to make sure that they are butted up against each other. You don't want to like overlap it by mistake. That's a no good. And so I'm gonna install all of this by hand. I've never had one of those like tools or anything to get this done. So as you can see, that's on there, and they're butted up against each other. And so the orientation of the oil scraper, so if we're looking at this diagram, front of the engine is that way, and so the oil ring extender gap needs to go just like that. Front of the engine, oil ring scraper. Now the top and bottom oil scraper rings, the retainer rings, they do not have an orientation. You can't mess these up. I will say this though, if the ring has any writing on it, like this top ring right here, it says N50 right there, that writing goes up. It doesn't go like that, it goes up like that. So just keep that in mind. The top ring gap is going to be over here for the oil scraper, and the bottom ring gap is going to be over here, so on the two opposing exhaust sides. So the top ring on the oil scraper is a little bit more difficult than the first two, but just take your time. Don't rush the process. Boom. There we go. So now all of these are oriented the correct way. Just try not to move them too much, and they should stay in their correct position. So now that you've got that good to go, do the second ring. So like I said, hopefully this shows up on camera pretty well, but you got a dark ring and a light ring. The darker one is your second compression ring. It's the bottom ring, so to speak. It's above the oil scraper, but below the top ring. So you want to grab that second ring, make sure you can see the writing. Yep, N50. put that on the top, just like so. And then we got our top compression ring gap and our second compression ring gap. So this is going to go towards the front of the engine, so we're gonna put this gap right here at this dot that I made. And again, just be very gentle, and you can do this by hand. You don't need a special tool to get this done. And I find that using my hands, because I have used those specific tools to get them done, I find that doing it by hand allows me to be a lot more gentle. And there we go. Second ring is done. Now the top ring, it's exact opposite. So it goes over here towards the back of the engine. So we're gonna get that put on. And this ring is arguably the easiest because, or the distance you're trying to travel is not very much, I should say. Done. So you're just gonna do this 3 more times, and then we can slot them into the block. Just make sure that before we slot them into the block, all the rings are where they need to be, which we're gonna check that right now. Quick note, just so you guys know, these Manly Turbo Tough I-beam connecting rods, they come with ARP 2000 cap bolts, but I have upgraded to these 42321-4. These are the ARP 625 plus new age connecting rod bolts. Got those from Summit, and these will be a awesome addition to our turbo build. So let's get these into the block. Okay, so the age-old technique of getting rods and pistons into an engine block is to use the soft end, the wood end of a hammer. So we're going to be using this mallet to kind of hammer the things in. But one really awesome purchase I made was this Wiseco piston ring compressor that sits against the block. I think these are much cooler and much better than the old style that you have to kind of tighten with an Allen wrench. So these are 87.5 millimeter, which is the same size as the pistons that we got. So this should work a treat. So we're gonna oil this up, oil the pistons up, and get these pressed into the block. Only downside to these is that you know, it's a one size, so you can't use it on anything else. But nice tapered fit, looks awesome. So this should fix us up just fine. So we're gonna get this lubed up. This is going to be a very, very messy part of the build. There's no real way around it, I'm afraid. So I'm just going to double check everything one more time. This is the exhaust side. So the exhaust side of the engine is on the K24, K20. It's where the oil filter is. So the exhaust side is back here, front of the engine, obviously. Back of the engine is where the engine stand is. And so from this point on, we're gonna lube this up really, really well, and we're just gonna press her in. And as far as I'm concerned, you can't have too much lube. These are gonna get coated in oil anyway. Okay, here we go. I'm gonna clean that. That was exciting. Whew, the nerves got to me, obviously. Oh. All right, so cylinder number 1 went in with without too much fuss. So, you know, if you're worried about, you know, breaking a ring or something like that, if you had broken a ring, you would have just heard it. It's pretty obvious when a ring breaks. By the way, just in case if any of you are curious, the oil that I'm using to like lube up everything, this is the same oil that I showed you guys in the parts video. It's the driven braking oil, so I figured, you know, might as well just use that oil everywhere since it's going to be the oil that's braking in the engine. All right, number 2, final check on the rings. Going in. Once you get the first piston in, the rest follows suit pretty well. So just rinse and repeat, take your time. There's no need to be in a rush here. Just remember to double check your rings, oil up the cylinder wall, and make sure the piston is oriented in the correct position. All right, last one. No chances. Lubing it up really well. It's always the last one, isn't it? But yeah, if you're on the fence about this this style piston ring compressor, just buy the damn thing. Now that you've successfully got all of your pistons pressed in, now it's time to flip the block over and assemble everything that's in the crankcase. We start by removing the crankcase girdle, and I feel that apologies are in order. I completely forgot to show you guys how to install main studs. The procedure is exactly the same as installing the head studs, and I will overlay a video of that here. Make sure to coat the threads in an even layer of ARP assembly lube. And I only put them in hand tight and then give them a quarter turn with an Allen wrench. There's a lot of controversy surrounding actually tightening these down with tools, and a lot of people say that you're only supposed to use the Allen head insert in order to remove the studs. But based on a lot of advice that was given to me and a lot of reading and research I've done, I've opted into tightening them down just a quarter of a turn with an Allen wrench. Nothing too crazy. Here's the part number for the oil squirter bolts that I'm using. These are brand new from Honda. They're very expensive. Here's the actual squirter part number itself. I made a video a long time ago about using the Golden Eagle plugs to block these off so that way more oil pressure can go to more vital parts of the build. Since I'm going to be actually like tracking this car instead of drag racing it, where it's going to see varying RPMs instead of really high RPMs constantly and only for a short amount of time, I've decided to go with some brand new oil squirters and run them in this block so that way it keeps everything nice and cool. In case you're wondering, the oil squirter torque specs are 12 foot-pounds. Okay everybody, these are the ACL bearings that we're going to be using. These are race bearings. Part number is 5 Mike 1959 Hotel. We did have to turn the crank, so these are 0.25 larger than factory. So we're going to clean the block, and we're going to clean the girdle and that holds everything together, and we're going to get the surfaces really clean, because the back side of the bearing, this part has to be installed dry. There is nothing you put on these. They have to be totally clean and totally dry. Right before you put the crank in, you lube everything. You can't have too much lube at that point. So we're going to get those in. Don't forget the thrust bearing, or the thrust washer, whatever you want to call it, but the washer, the bearing, whatever, that goes right here. Super important for manual cars, because that's what keeps the crank from walking back and forth whenever you're pushing the clutch and you're pushing all that force, well, technically this way, against the back of the engine block. Dadgummit. I know between past me and current me that there's a lot of overlapping information, and I am reiterating myself quite a bit, but I just want to make sure that you are all completely in the loop on what exactly it is that I'm doing and the proper procedure to getting this done the right way the first time. So I just want to make that totally clear. I'm not trying to push anything onto anybody. This is just exactly the way that I am doing this, and I just want to make sure that I am driving that home perfectly clear. The main bearings and rod bearings ship with a protective coating on them, some type of oil, so I'm making sure that I'm cleaning the convex side of those bearings extremely well before I put them into the block. Again, like I said, the back side of the bearing, the convex side, the part that curves outwardly, that is the part that you want to make sure that there's no oil or anything, no residue on that part of the bearing, because you want that to be totally dry against the block, and you want the block to be totally dry as well. I'm doing that for both the mains and the rod bearings. Just keep that in mind, please. When pulling off the rod caps, make sure that they are oriented the correct way when you put them back on. They only go one way, and they only go to each rod that they come off of. If you're like me, you may struggle with getting your rod caps off of the rods themselves. I personally found the best way to do that was to loosen the rod bolts, back out a few threads, and smack the top of the rod bolt itself with a hammer. Seems a little barbaric, but it was the only way that I could get the rod cap to break free from the rod itself. So I've seen a bunch of other people do this as well and confirm that sometimes this is just the way that you have to do it. I did not see or feel any damage to the rod or rod cap or bolt itself while I was doing this, so be as gentle as you can, and good luck to you. After you successfully pull off each of the rod caps, we're going to be installing the rod bearings in both the rod portion and the cap portion. This is going to be a rinse and repeat step, pretty much the same exact thing that we did with the mains. So we're going to clean the inside of the cap and the inside of the rod, and we're going to install the bearing once we wipe everything clean and we know everything is perfectly dry. Again, reiterating, do not get the caps turned around or mixed up between the 4 rods. Be sure to align the bearing tangs with the grooves that are recessed inside of the caps and rods themselves. After we have those installed and they're good to go, it's time to coat all 4 rod bearings and all 5 main bearings in some assembly lube. And don't forget about the bearings inside of the girdle itself. And once we have all that taken care of, it is time to lower the crankshaft into the crankcase. I suppose the center journal here doesn't have a oil passage, so it's just all of the rod journals and the 4 main journals. Just wanted to make sure those were clear. All right, let's put this thing in the engine block. The grooves of the thrust washers, flat side, grooves go towards the crank, the flat side sits inside the cap. And now the crank can't walk back and forth. Crank's installed. Next step, we got to get the rods onto the rod journals. So the next caveat in this video that I wanted to talk to you guys about is that some of you eagle-eyed viewers will notice that I am not using plasti gauges. For those of you that don't know, plasti gauges are these little wax strips that you cut that come with a gauge sheet that you put on the crankshaft and you torque down your bearing cap, and it squishes this little wax strip into a measurable state where you know what type of bearing clearance you have with your rods to your crank and your crank to your mains. I'm not going to be using those because the machine shop, again, measured all of these clearances for me. They measured the housing bore, and they're the ones that specified which bearings that I needed to be using for my rods and my mains. Being completely transparent with you guys, I do not know enough to be able to tell you why I'm not using plasti gauges. I was simply told and informed that they are not accurate enough to give me the correct information on which bearings that I needed to run in this engine. What makes sense to me is that if you have enough math and you've done that math correctly, you do not need something that is based purely on how much torque you apply to a main cap to let you know your bearing clearance. Putting it simply, the guys at the machine shop told me that plasti gauges are not accurate enough. They know more about their profession than I do, so I took their advice to heart. If you're one of those people that are totally okay with using plasti gauges, more power to you. I know for some people they just do it out of pure habit and that's what works for them. Again, this is simply how I built this engine. I hope this helps. I said it once, I'll say it again. Make sure your caps are going on the exact same way they came off. Don't forget the lube like I almost did. Also, be sure to coat the threads of your rod bolts with ARP assembly lube. I've already done it. I use a ratchet to snug up the rod bolts to pull the rod and the cap together before finally torquing them down to 55 foot-pounds. We are now going to torque the rod bolts to 55 foot-pounds, so we're going to hit them at 25 and then finish it up at 55. Alright, that's everything to 25. We're going to jump up to 55. Torquing to 55 foot-pounds. The next couple steps we're going to take, we're going to clean the girdle and the mating surface on the block itself, and we're going to apply Honda Bond before we mate the girdle up. Using my impact to run the girdle bolts down, I like to just get them just snug to the surface, so when we torque down the main studs, there's less manipulation that can happen on the girdle itself and all the bolts are already threaded. When torquing the girdle down to the short block, be sure to add ARP assembly lube to the top and bottom of the ARP washer itself and to the threads of the stud, so that way when you torque down the nut, you get a nice even torque across the entire board. It also helps to put some ARP assembly lube on the bottom of the nut itself, and just make sure to either coat the threads themselves of the stud or the threads of the nut. I usually do both. It's one of those situations where you don't want to use too much, but you don't want to use too little either. So don't overthink it, just put enough. I'm just running it down with this. Relax. I'm going to take these up to 35 and then we're going to go to 60. Okay, now we're doing the final torque at 60 foot-pounds.
Daddy, look at me.
You're beautiful, baby. Going back and checking. All right, should be good. I'm gonna go back and check all the small bolts again because that may have really bit that down on top of everything. These small girdle bolts that are 12s, 16 foot-pounds. Next, we're going to install our Drag Cartel modified crank gear, our 4-piston ported Type S oil pump, brand new Honda oil chain, torquing the two 12mm bolts to 16 foot-pounds and the 10mm bolt to 8.7 foot-pounds. Topping off the crankshaft with our Drag Cartel modified crank position sensor trigger, and finally our oil chain guide. Okay, so it's been a long day. And it is my birthday, so we're about to go out to eat. So the rest of this is gonna have to wait until later. But assuming, and I hate assuming things, but let's just assume I did everything right on the bottom end. If I did, well, that would be one, wonderful. But two, it would also mean that if I rotate the crank bolt, everything else will rotate with it. And it does. It really does.
We'll continue this when I get back, but that's a big win for me. I'm so excited.
Next time on the 1,000 horsepower K24 build.
I said, here's to 1,000 horsepower. I'll be faster one day.
Okay, cool. I dig it. I hope you are.
You're shaking.
Is it really?
Yeah.
Are you sure?
Yep.
All right, ready?